21 Solaris greed by Hydesgrain. There were only 5 Afrita and 1 Afri with his soulbond left, but Jason had to remain vigilant. Before, he had killed the weaker opponents, which had different now. The last 5 Afrita had liquefied between 50 to 100 drops of mana, and their physical enhancement should make the strongest of them more powerful than Jason was currently. Yet, instead of feeling threatened, Jason couldn't help but smile as he looked at his opponents that tried to figure out what they should do. He was already rushing ahead, but instead of attacking the Afrita or the last Afri, Jason took care of the largest foe first. It was not that important, but the 5-meter-tall bear prevented him from seeing everything behind him clearly. As such, Jason jumped towards its head when he emerged a meter in front of the large bear. He slashed out with Byakuur, which was enveloped in a thin, yet compressed membrane of Solaris flames. At the same time, its runes to sharpen and increase the lethality of the blade had been activated by inserting mana in Byakuur. The bear tried to use its huge paw to smash Jason in the ground, but its attempt was futile because it had been too late by a quarter of a second. Jason was already in front of its head as the paw slashed through empty air. Cleaving out with Byakuur, Jason felt that an immense might had been released from it as the compressed black flame that was tightly laid around Byakuur unleashed their might. With loud sizzling noises, Byakuur slashed through the large bear's neck without any resistance. From the way it looked, spectators might question whether the large bear had been a lick stage beast with 80 drops of liquefied mana or an unblemished beast. It was a highly physically attributed beast with a strong defense, but everything this looked insignificant in front of Byakuur that was razor sharp and the ominous black flame Jason was able to control to his heart's content. Jason hadn't expected that Byakuur would be this sharp with Solaris flames that augmented its lethality while nullifying some of the mana the bear had been circulating at the location he had been targeting. Nevertheless, Jason was fully aware that the fight had yet to end and there was still 5 Afrita and 1 Afri left. Though his opponents were scared out of their wits when they had figured out that the black flame was not only a unique flame, like theirs, but an origin flame, Jason wanted to finish the fight as soon as possible. The weightless steps still exerted at the perfect mastery. Jason's speed that had already accelerated by 60%, increased further as he circulated even more mana through his body. A moment after he had slashed at the large bear, which caused a severe injury that would kill it within the next few seconds, Jason had already pushed himself from its body to continue his slaughter. Targeting the closest Afrita that was next to him, Jason emerged in front of it as 5 whip of fire lashed out at him. The weakest whip had the strength of a lowest lick with 50 drops of liquefied mana, and Jason had to face 4 more, stronger whip attacks too. This pressured him a little bit, but when he sensed Solaris confidence, Jason couldn't help but smile. Both his and Solaris stigma were fully unleashed, and it was the first time they noticed how great of an advantage the stigma turned out to be. Solaris, who was currently in his mana core, and Jason seemed to fuse further, and it felt like the function of manifesting one's body part had increased by a huge margin. By using less than a quarter of his mana, Jason was able to summon huge flames that flickered in the surrounding 5 meters, burning everything with Solaris unfolding its might. The mana nullification, augmented by the stigma, burned through the fire whips, decreasing their strength drastically. This allowed Jason to evade him as he slashed out at the closest Afrita that had already begun to burn. With one thrust of Byakuur, he ended the Afrita's life before he had changed his direction without looking back. The weakened whips lashed out at the position he stood a moment earlier, burning long stripes on their already dead brethren's carcass. With only 5 opponents were left, Jason was confident to win. However, it was not his plan to kill everyone. As such, the moment he emerged in front of the last Afri that slashed at him with the long broadsword in his hand, Jason couldn't help but use Byakuur, amplified by Solaris flames, in order to scrap the weapon in its hands. After he had scraped the sword of his opponent, Jason moved Byakuur smoothly around in order to utilize all his strength to strike the Afri's head with Byakuur's handle. A thump sound echoed through the surroundings as the Afri's eyes turned white. However, Now Jason had been forced to push him away in order to prevent both him and the Ifrit from being lashed at by the remaining 4 Ifriters' whips. He planned to let the last and strongest Ifrit alive because he might be able to get more information out of him. It would be weird if a weaker Ifrit knew more information than the strongest one of the group, and Jason was confident that he would be able to figure out intel that might be useful for later. Jason tried to do the same with the Ifriters, which was his reason to take care of the weakest opponents at the beginning of the fight. This might have been a mistake, but after he had knocked out the last Ifrit, the remaining 4 Ifriters didn't seem like a huge problem anymore. They were charging at him, even though he could see fear gleaming their bloodshot eyes, and Jason couldn't help but feel that they were more humane than the Ifrit might have ever been. Humans would also try to dominate everything weaker than themselves, only to fear the stronger. As such, he couldn't help but sigh deeply before he exerted the weightless steps technique again. He utilized the petrification curse in order to forcefully halt the Ifriters in advancing further. At that moment, their movements were interrupted and Jason, who could move freely, was able to pierce Byakhor through the closest Ifriter before the others had pierced with their weapons at him. However, what they didn't expect was that Solaris' huge flame that enveloped Jason and his surroundings was able to dominate their own flames. This meant that they couldn't fully control and unleash their flames' capabilities, which gave them another disadvantage. As such, within the following minute, Jason was able to exhibit the advantages he had in order to overwhelm the last 4 Ifriter. Using his eyes to instill fear and paralyze them to use the short moment their attack was interrupted in order to use Solaris, who was dominating the other flames, despite being weaker than them. By simply looking at the strength of their flames, Solaris was less developed and weaker. However, it was a Tier 1 origin flame, augmenting Byakhor, while nullifying and burning everything in their surrounding that had something to do with mana. This excluded Jason and Byakhor because all of them were connected to Jason, and his soul that was one entity with the soul-bound black origin flame, Solaris. Thus, after Jason had killed the 3rd Ifriter, he didn't hesitate a moment to slash at the last and strongest opponent with 100 drops of liquefied mana in its core, in order to damage its mana core. With a damaged mana core, the Ifriter wouldn't die, and the degree Jason had damaged its mana core was not severe, barely enough to prevent it from utilizing too much of its mana. Now that the fight was over and everyone except the strongest Ifrit and Ifriter had been killed, Jason couldn't help but sigh deeply when he looked around. He was aware that he had overwhelmed his opponents, but the fight felt extremely weird to him. Some of them should have been much stronger than me. Why are they so weak compared to the Shadow Walker? It's not only the difference in their mana core rank but mostly combat awareness, combat prowess, and experience. It almost feels like they're younglings, gathering their first combat experience, but that can't be, right? That would be way too reckless. While Jason was already deep in thoughts, confused about how he was able to defeat his opponents, that should have been much stronger, so easily, Solaris had already left his mana core. It appeared next to Jason and rushed ahead to the dead corpses that showed signs of being burned from the inside. However, this was not Solaris doing but the weird flames the Ifrit harbored. Meanwhile, the same, yet advanced flame could be found within the Ifriter. Solaris didn't care about either of that, and it split up its body in order to devour every single weird, but also interesting flame that was about to dissipate. Only after some time did Jason notice that something was going on with Solaris as he turned around to see huge black flames burning the dead Ifriter and Ifrit carcasses, while a distinct sensation of greed had been directly transmitted to Jason. Solaris, what are you even doing right now? Chapter 422 Suicidal Training Camp. By Hydesgrain. Jason was sure that Solaris was absorbing the weird flames that had been nurtured by life force, but he has yet to figure out what the use was. However, he had to take care of the unconscious Ifriter and Ifrit too. Before anything else, Jason had damaged the Ifrit's mana core too, preventing any possible accidents to happen. After that, he wanted to look out for their storage devices or spatial rings. There was something he wanted to figure out without asking them. As such, It was easier to look at the spatial ring without being forced to intimate or even torture them. It was still confusing to Jason that he didn't feel much by killing the Afri, which were in fact transformed humans, but after the initial disgust, there was nothing he had to worry about. This made him neither too comfortable nor uncomfortable, and it could be described as a weird balance. As such, he had decided that it was not something he should pay too much attention to, and he should rather look out for spatial devices. Not even a minute passed and he found 2 spatial rings on the unconscious Afrita and 1 on the Afri, only to notice that he was unable to access them. It's interesting to see that they use spatial rings too, but I should have expected that I won't be able to access them. Jason knew that the Afrita and Afri's mana fluctuations were imprinted into the spatial rings, and it would be weird for someone else to be able to access them. With that in mind, he turned towards the burning corpses that caused a disgusting stench to permeate the air. Their spatial rings should be accessible and with some useful information. Because he was unaffected by Solaris flames, Jason could act without being restricted. As such, less than 10 minutes had passed before Jason had gathered 11 spatial rings. At the same time, Solaris had already finished absorbing the unknown flame Jason had called pseudo-origin flames. This was not their name, but he was sure that he would figure out the truth soon. Skimming through the 11 spatial rings whose mana fluctuation imprints had dissipated with their owner's death, Jason couldn't help but frown. They're not necessarily poor, but that's just in comparison to humans. Was my assumption right, and they're common soldiers that attempt to gather their first combat experience? Within the spatial rings, there was a total of several tens of thousand mana stones, but compared to the wealth real human prodigies possessed, the average of all 11 spatial rings he had found shouldn't be much more than they had. Other than a few additional cultivation resources, Jason assumed to be used for body refinement, or to nurture their flame, every Afrita and Afri possessed the same cultivation manual. This cultivation manual was a unique body refining technique called Kriato's Hellflame. From that, Jason could tell that this technique had something to do with the flames his opponents had harbored. He looked through the first few pages of the introductory part. It was advantageous that he was a halfling from the Celestia race and not a pure human, because he understood everything written inside the body refining manual. However, Jason could only shake his head when he was done reading, because he could tell that the Kriato's Hellflame body refining technique was even worse than his. Jason had already expected that the Netherworld's Forte technique was bad because it increased his physical strength equal to 10 drops of liquefied mana after he had entered the first stage. This was less than Jason had hoped to receive, but from what he read, the increase of one's physical strength after completing the infant phase was less than 5 drops of liquefied mana. The Kriato flame that would be created and nurtured within one's body by using the Kriato's Hellflame body refining technique was only suitable to the Afrita race, and other races would receive severe backlashes, even if it would seem different in the beginning. When Jason read this, he could tell that his assumption about the Kriato flame within the transformed humans was not entirely correct. The Afrita race didn't nurture the Kriato flames within humans to use them for themselves, but it was more likely that the Afri were the test objects, with which the Afrita had tried out a few things. However, when he read further, this didn't seem to be correct too, because Kriato flames could devour each other and nurture themselves through this. It's as if the Afrita race wants to experiment with humans while reaping benefits. Because he didn't want to continue misinterpreting the situation, Jason decided that his last assumption was correct until he got to know the truth. After that, he transferred the content of all 11 spatial rings into his own before he laid them aside. Once he was done, Jason manifested Artemis wings after she had entered his mana core before he soared into the sky. There was no need to waste any more time, and Jason could tell that it was better to depart as soon as possible. Who could know when stronger reinforcement might arrive? Jason couldn't perceive anyone in the surrounding 2 kilometers, but nobody could reassure him that there was nobody with a spatial affinity. He had to manifest Artemis talons once again and grasped the unconscious Afrita and Afri tightly without bothering about being too careful. While flying, his thoughts lingered around the possibility Emily had already issued a while before. They're definitely poor, even if it looks like a lot for us, and their combat experience was almost non-existent. Does that mean Emily was right? Do some races plan to use our planet as a training ground? Isn't that almost as if they're damaging themselves? From what I can tell, most foreign races on Argos are roughly equal in their combat prowess. Jason mumbled all kinds of possibilities that appeared in his mind, and there was only one solution that made sense to him. There are three groups consist of the races that want to enslave humans, take them for themselves, without sharing, and those who want to prevent a single race from being able to reign over humans. Meanwhile, the third faction seems to be a hellish training camp with a high death rate. That would, however, indicate that the death didn't matter to the whole race, while the benefits had to be much higher in comparison. It was not difficult to tell that those three factions were a bad combination because all races amongst these three factions would attack each other, and Jason doubted that they bothered about a few million if not a billion casualties. They should be aware of mankind's ability to procreate fast, while several hundred years were nothing to those races. As such, Jason could only hope that the foreign races wouldn't send out their elite and strong powerhouses to Argos. Instead, they should send their common soldiers, or those that were in training to become the elite of their race. It was difficult to figure out the real reason for every race to appear and wage war against everyone on Argos, but Jason could tell that he was slowly approaching the truth. This should have made him happy, but from what he could tell, the truth was nothing to be happy about. After he flew towards the location where Shane and the others were, he extinguished his stigma's glow before he descended. The whole battle was already over and Jason could see many humans gathering spatial rings without bothering about the people from a foreign race that stood next to them. Descending slowly, it was not difficult to notice his approach. If his masters and Emily weren't next to a middle-aged man who was talking with them, Jason would have been a little bit nervous. Yet, because he could tell that the foreign race he saw was the mysterious race that had teamed up with the Shiabi clan, Jason was able to stay calm. At the same time, his master's calmness helped him to maintain this state and Jason landed on the ground after he loosened the grasp around the Afrita and Afri. Artemis' talons and wings disintegrated and Jason could only see that everyone eyed him with vigilance until they noticed that he was a human with a fortified soul conjunction. This was however not less weird because Jason looked like he was not even 20 years old. Fortunately, Jason didn't care about the curious and envious gazes as he dragged the two unconscious people behind him. When Shane noticed him, Jason couldn't help but smile lightly. I'm done and brought two presents with me. Chapter 423 Arior by Hydesgrain. Jason was still astonished by how mysterious the unknown race looked, but he tried to not show his surprise as he stood in front of his masters. There was a middle-aged man next to them with several thousand liquefied drops of mana within his mana core. This indicated that he was at the Lord rank, as one required 1,000 liquefied drops for every level of the Lord rank. Yet, if one were to look at it closely, the unknown race's strength was much higher. Their number was smaller in comparison, but Jason could tell that the quantity of liquefied mana, their silver affinity with which Jason was unfamiliar with and their physical strength was much higher. In the end, one of those from the unknown race should be able to fight against 5 to 10 humans at once, probably even more. This came mainly from the fact that Jason perceived their aura, which was filled with killing intent from the fight they had overcome. Killing intent couldn't be established without having fought hundreds of life or death battles or overcoming hundreds, if not thousands of deaths under unique circumstances. As such, the unknown race that supported the Shiabi clan had to be proficient in fighting, which was also his biggest reason to look at their race's combat prowess so highly. They're called Arior, Shane said when he saw Jason staring at the foreign race. The Arior race was mostly shaped like any bipedal beast, with 2 legs and arms, yet there were also 4-legged individuals. Seeing this was not really surprising for Jason. He already knew that something like this was possible with some races. This was because Netherworld's Fort body refining technique had already informed him about a race with two-legged and four-legged individuals. Though Jason doubted that the Arior race's four-legged individuals were weaker than the humanoid Arior, it was possible. Nevertheless, what astonished Jason more was that their body was completely made out of silver liquid, which caused him to blurt out, "Quicksilver." Their silver liquid had exactly the same color as the Arior's affinity had, and Jason couldn't help but feel that both affinity and the liquid they were made out of were the same materials, quicksilver. When the middle-aged man that had been talking to Shane and Dahlia heard this, he sized Jason up for the first time since he arrived. Behind him were an unconscious Ephrata and a Free that had both the damaged mana core. Nevertheless, one could still determine that the number of liquefied drops of mana within the Ephrata exceeded 100. How strong is this youth? This youngster fought against a Ephrata with 100 drops of liquefied mana and he is unscathed. Did someone help him? His rank shouldn't be high enough to defeat the Free and Ephrata. The middle-aged man couldn't answer a single question he had in mind, which felt weird. However, after seeing that the young man was acquainted with the strong man that helped him out, he had nothing left to say. Thus, he turned back Shane as he said, "Thank you for helping us out. The number of our casualties decreased drastically due to your intervention. If it's not too much trouble, I would like to invite Sir to follow us to the Shiabi clan. At least if Sir doesn't feel uncomfortable with the Arior race comes along. They build a small camp at our headquarters." When Jason heard how the middle-aged man talked, he couldn't help but frown deeply. He doesn't seem to like the Arior race. Is that because of the prejudice of foreign races, or is there something wrong with them? Jason couldn't tell for sure, and instead of listening to the middle-aged man that was at the late lick stage, he looked around to see if there was something interesting. Solaris attempted to leave his soul world, but instead of allowing it to leave it, Jason had to suppress the origin flame from trying to absorb the remains of the Creato flames that had yet to dissipate. He didn't feel any difference within Solaris, but it had transmitted him the thought that absorbing more flames would be very beneficial for it to use. As such, he couldn't help but ponder for a moment, thinking that he would have to publicly reveal that Solaris was an origin flame if he were to release it right now. This would be annoying, but from what he understood, everyone had their own, bigger problems right now. There was a huge war devastating Canir, causing the death of humans every second. However, before he, or rather Solaris, did something it was not supposed to do, Jason decided that it was better to ask the middle-aged man about it. He seemed to be the leader of the group, with the most authority, if one were to leave out the Arior. They were unlikely to allow being ordered around by someone with a weaker combat prowess and stance than they had, let alone other humans. The Arior race seemed to help the Shiabi clan and not the other way around. But Jason wanted to be sure, which led him to ask, only to be frowned upon. "You want to use the Ephrata and Ivris carcasses? To burn them at that? Why?" Jason didn't want to answer, but he couldn't help but feel that it was necessary. "My flame is slightly unique and I can tell that it will be beneficial for it." After the middle-aged man heard this, he shrugged his shoulders as if he didn't care about the carcasses of the foreign races. Jason accepted this as a, "do whatever you want," sign and turned around in order to walk towards the center of the battlefield. While walking, he could hear a few Arior talking with each other, and he was able to understand everything. They might not be aware of the fact, but Jason was able to understand the universal language all races seem to speak. This allowed him to hear the discussion, which sounded more like they were lamenting about the current situation. Is it really necessary to protect those humans? This planet is so disgusting and its scarcity of mana feels like I'm walking through sullied lands, one of the Arior that had the shape of a four-legged beast said. Calm down. You know that we need them if we want to continue fighting against the Doom Crawls. Their curse is too harmful to us, the 3-meter-tall humanoid Arior, Jason passed by, said. But we could. Stop. Don't even think of proposing that we should just take away what we need and run away. We have our own pride. Furthermore, there is the pact we signed with the Shiabi clan. Cope with it. The curse cleansing ability is something we can't live without while waging war with a cursed race. You recall my brother's appearance, right? Completely black. It was already a miracle that he survived, and the curse cleansing ability of the Shiabi clan saved him. What Jason heard astonished him, and he wanted to figure out much more. However, in order to do so, he would have to reveal that he was able to speak in the universal language. As such, he had to suppress himself. Standing in the center of the battlefield, he summoned Solaris, who immediately split up in several dozen tiny flames before the shot towards all directions, infesting the Ephrata and Ivris bodies, devouring the small traces of the Creato flames that were left behind. The members of the Shiabi clan had already eyed him weirdly since he had demonstrated that he had a fortified soul conjunction with a flying beast. Now that he released a weird, black flame that split up before it infested the bodies of the deceased foes. How could they not think that this was weird? Something felt odd to them, but most people couldn't get the hang of it as one of them shouted out. The black flame is devouring the last traces of the Ephrata and Ivris flames. What kind of demonic flame is that? When Jason heard this, he couldn't help but shake his head as he mumbled. Demonic. More like the purest flame you guys will ever see in your life. However, nobody except the two individuals from the Arior race he had passed earlier heard him. Yet, they couldn't really understand what he was saying because of the language barrier between them. Nevertheless, what they could tell for sure was the fact that the black-haired young-looking human that had golden silverish eyes was not ordinary, while the same could be said for the flame within his hand. Solaris had split of several dozen small flames from it to devour the Creato flames while controlling everything neatly. Floating around Jason's hand, he smiled lightly because Solaris behaved similarly to a small child that didn't want their parent to go working. Suddenly, he noticed someone from the Arior race approaching him who asked him in broken human language. Is that a true origin flame? Jason lifted his eyebrows when he heard that the Arior spoke to him in human language because that was not something he expected a late lick stage Arior to be able to do. However, someone had to translate what humans and Arior were speaking about, otherwise, it would be difficult to create a soul contract, pact or whatever treaty one planned to sign with each other. As such, Jason couldn't help as he smiled lightly before he said in human language. Yes, it's an origin flame. Chapter 424 Shiabi Clan by Hydesgrain. When the human-like Arior heard this, the liquefied body that seemed to be made out of something similar to quicksilver created ripples before it turned around to leave again. At the same time, it began to speak in the universal language. Where did a human get such a high-ranked origin flame from? The humanoid Arior's voice was neither loud nor quiet, thus many Arior could hear what their brethren, who was one of the highest ranked in their small group, said. Origin flame. A high-ranked one at that. Aren't those able to cleanse impurities, soothe curses, and pain? This puny planet shouldn't have any origin flame yet. Did this youth get them by using the world bridge to enter one of the volcanic worlds? No, he would have burned alive. High-ranked origin flames are extremely rare to find for common or higher races, but even grand races have problems with that. Jason figured out that he had accidentally created turmoil within the Arior races group, but instead of being worried about anything, he was able to figure out a lot of new information he was unaware of before. It was obvious that mankind's and the Arior race's standards of a high-ranked origin flame were different. As such, he could tell that Solaris was even rare within foreign races, which might be different with D or E rank origin flames. Maybe even Dahlia's origin flame was not rare, but Jason doubted that this was the case. Her clan should have obtained a relatively rare one for her, even if it was unclear how exactly they were able to pay the price for something all foreign races found valuable. If he were to take the Creato flames in comparison, their capabilities were at the F, at most E rank origin flame. For most humans, this was already great because one could create the Creato flame out of one's own body. Yet, the technique utilized to do something like that was not really special, and Jason doubted that it was anything special. That was if one were to look at it rationally. Every single one of the inexperienced Afriter and Afri had such a technique, and it wouldn't be a surprise if every single individual of them had one. Other than that, Jason figured out that there seemed to be a ranking for foreign races. He was not sure about the proper requirements one had to cross in order to be called a common, higher, or grand race, but it was a good indicator for Jason to tell which race he had to pay attention to. From the Arior race's shock, Jason thought that their race was at most a higher ranked race and not a grand one, but that was not important right now. Half an hour had passed since Solaris had split up its body when the prior thin flames that had turned into thick, vivid flames returned. Merging with Solaris' main body, he could tell that something about was to change, yet he was not exactly sure what. However, exactly as Jason had already assumed, Solaris began to demand more soul energy units from him. It also transmitted him the thought that its demand was not as high as it would be normally because it was able to use a small part of the Creato flame to nurture its mana core. But this was even weirder for Jason because he had initially thought that Solaris would nurture itself with the Creato flame it had devoured. "Is there something you want to enhance?" he asked himself while transmitting this thought, only to receive no answer in return. Thus, he could only shrug his shoulders and allow Solaris to take a few soul energy units in order to let him see what degree its demand for soul energy decreased to. Yet, before Jason could take a proper look, he saw that his masters and Emily walked towards him as Shane said, "The Shiabi clan and Arior will depart now. Let's go with them. We should be able to receive more information from the Shiabi clan than we could acquire from anyone else around." Nodding his head, Jason looked around the battlefield one last time before he followed his masters. The group of the Shiabi clan and the Arior race divided themselves into those who could fly through the sky and the other side that was unable. The Arior race was able to fly through the sky, without the need to rely on a specific mana core rank or other external means. The only thing they had to do was utilizing their affinity, which allowed them to control their whole Quicksilver liquid body. Jason found this interesting, but also a little bit confusing because it didn't really make sense to him. However, when Jason saw through his mana eyes how much mana they had to exert and how precise their control over the silver affinity was, he had to acknowledge that the Arior race was somewhat unique. Maybe there were multiple races with similar predicaments on Canir right now, but Jason hoped that their combat prowess and combat experience were not as high as the Ariors. Though there was one somewhat bad information which he had heard before, but he did not really understand them. What is the cleanse cursing ability they had been talking about, and how devastating must being cursed as an Arior be if their whole body turns black? Wouldn't that mean their Quicksilver body would be infested, or is it something different? Either way, the most important information is the fact that the Arior race is at war with the Doom Crawls. If they were to encounter each other on Canir, the current, rather calm situation within the Chandra country would turn awry. Jason couldn't help but think that everything had become more complicated than it had already been before. As such, instead of following most members back to the Shiabi clan by foot, he manifested Artemis Wing to fly next to the Arior race. There were a few humans that had fortified soul conjunctions too, but they didn't want to fly around without the others around them. They felt weird and uncomfortable around the Arior race, which was not something surprising for most humans as they had never encountered a foreign race before. The recent times were the beginning of something new all over Canir, and Jason predicted that mankind and the whole planet would never be the same as they had been before. As such, Jason decided to fly within the Arior race's group instead of lingering around them, which was eyed weirdly by both humans and the Ario race. Neither expected him to fly with the Arior instead of using a soulbond to mount in order to rush over the plains they were currently on. It was weird for the others, but Jason didn't care about that at all. He heard a few Arior gossiping with each other about him, and Jason couldn't help but smile lightly, which he tried to suppress. Unfortunately, this was more difficult than he had expected, and it was necessary for him to cover his mouth with one hand. At the same time, he took a look at Solaris within the soul world, trying to figure out what it was going to do. However, what he noticed brought forth more questions than it answered. Chapter 425 Standpoint by Hydesgrain. The number of soul energy units Solaris had annexed was 10,000. This was the threshold a magical rank beast could take on the most. However, Solaris was neither a beast, had limited potential, nor was the magical rank relevant for Jason and his soul bonds anymore. Important was just the fact that Solaris had burned around 15,000 soul energy units and annexed 7,000 units, which decreased Jason's soul energy units to slightly more than 210,000. There was still more than enough left, but what confused Jason was that he was able to perceive the Creato flame within Solaris. This was weird, and he began to ask himself what this could mean, as Solaris had already answered everything with a simple transmitted thought. You can learn how to steal life force as long as you absorb enough Creato flames. Ugh, I hope you mean from beasts you evade and not from me. Jason was sure that Solaris wouldn't try to drain his life force, but the thought was scary and he couldn't help but visualize it. He shivered for a short moment, which the surrounding Arior noticed, but Jason was still deep in thought, thinking about what Solaris transmitted him. Doesn't that mean Solaris can learn other flames' abilities? That's great. But, also somewhat weird, wouldn't it be more logical to augment the already existing abilities instead of stealing other flames' abilities? There was also the fact that Solaris had explained to him. Apparently, it would need several thousand more Creato flame in order to learn the ability that would allow Solaris to drain one's life force. At the same time, Solaris even requested him to search for more Afrita and Afri to kill them, so that it could absorb their flames the moment they died. Jason didn't answer this, but instead, he changed the topic. Try enhancing your mana nullification ability first. Or the purification ability. It's good to have many abilities, but if your fire's strength is not enough to invade the inner parts of your opponents, a life force draining ability is not that great. Purifying is great for support and non-combat purposes, while nullifying mana is superb, and you know that. Solaris was already extremely strong and the affinity Jason used the most, and it would be great if Solaris would obtain a life force draining ability, but in his opinion, the mana nullification ability would still be stronger. Nullifying mana could be used for both attacking and defending, and Jason was sure that this was the most important, being versatile, efficient, and powerful. Thus, he had transmitted those words to Solaris, who had quieted down. After that, Jason decided to focus on his surroundings and the Arior race that was around him. They were not far from the Shiabi clan's headquarters, but he wanted to figure out everything about the Arior race as soon as possible. This human is weird. Why does he stare at us like that? Does he know other foreign races, or why is he not affected while staying around us? We should be the first foreign race he meets, at least with such a large number. Or did he already fought next to foreign races in Argos War? Unfortunately, Jason didn't hear any new, useful information, and the Arior race had just begun gossiping with each other. Only 1 hour later, did he finally hear something interesting. Don't you think that most races exaggerate a little bit? I'm aware of the value the human race holds, but they're not strong enough to be on par with grand races, even with their soul awakening and the fact that they receive an amplification from the beasts they tame. At most, a few with an extremely high soul awakening might be on par, but nurturing them won't bring any race enough benefits. It was a humanoid Arior who had asked this, and a heated debate seemed to start because of his words. Exaggerate. There should be around 20 common races and more than 6 higher races who joined this war. That's not exaggerating the value of the human race's value, but it's insane. Most of those common races desire the threshold of a higher race, and humans have enough potential to achieve that. At least if they were to enter the right environment. With enough resources, a suitable body refining technique, and strong beasts they can tame, one can transform a human into a powerhouse. at least for most common races standards. And I was just talking about individuals from the human race with an above-average soul awakening. I think you can imagine what extent high soul awakenings might allow a human to reach. The four-legged beast Ariel that had said this, looked to the ground, trying to find someone to make an example of as Jason flew past it. Just take the winged human as an example. Compared to the other humans, he is extremely young, but you should have seen that he arrived with an unconscious Ephrata that had liquefied 100 drops of mana. He has yet to get into an environment with more mana than the scarce lands we are currently on. Despite that, he attained such a high combat prowess. If nurtured properly, he should be able to become as strong as we are, a higher ranked race. Immediately afterward, the large humanoid Ariel that had spoken to Jason before answered the first, suspicious Ariel's question too. Most common races are desperate, and the higher ranked races are just trying to prevent them from becoming too strong. They fear being conquered too. There is a balance between those races that want to take the human race's soul awakening ability for themselves. The others that want to prevent that from happening at all costs. At the same time, there is the Ephrata race and other races, whether it's a common or higher one, with a huge numerical advantage. They want to create elite warriors from the common soldiers. Our stance is different from everyone else's, but they're aware of that, which is why most races try to avoid it. To put it simply, we might be one of the strongest races that joined this war, if one were to exclude the Myoldra and Doomcrawls, who can fight against us because of their curse's advantage. However, there are also many races that desperately fight for their survival. They're threatened to be conquered by other races on a daily basis, and upon seeing the human race's soul awakening potential, it is obvious why so many races began joining this war. It's relatively quiet right now, but we'll never know when this might change. Jason was flooded with information which caused a light headache, but he was glad that he was able to understand the universal language. So it's like that. I should be missing lots of important information, but if I understood everything correctly, the foreign races are divided into 3 sections as we already expected. But 26 foreign races on Canea, isn't that a little bit over the top? Are they so desperate, greedy, or do they value humans that much? The more answers he received, the more questions flooded his mind, and Jason couldn't help but think that it was extremely weird. Their discussion continued, and Jason's mind was overflowing with information when they had finally arrived in front of the Shabi clan headquarters. Thank goodness, he mumbled before diving towards his masters and Emily. Chapter 426, terminated by Hydesgrain. They had arrived at the Shiabi clan, and the Ariel that had separated from the rest returned to their own camp. At the same time, the captured Ephrata and Efree were left with a guard to figure out more information. There was no need to ask why they had entered Argos, because it was a useless piece of information, but more importantly was the number of Ephrata and Efree, their average strength, how strong the strongest Ephrata was, and what kind of strategy they pursued. All of that was important, and Jason expected that the Shiabi clan was able to receive some information. He was curious about the curse cleansing ability and his assumption that curses were more lethal on the Ariel race than others. However, Jason was sure that he would get to know everything soon enough. Walking through the large yard the Shiabi clan headquarters had, he looked around and noticed several things that pricked his interest. The number of strong humans was much more than he had expected them to be, while the variety of elemental transmutations Jason perceived within most humans was wider than it should be for a single clan. It was said that most clans had 2, at most 3 common elements they focused on. This originated from the fact that the body refining techniques the clans had were focused on those elementals. At the same time, the main family branch's descendants had mostly those 2 to 3 affinities when they had undergone the soul awakening. Yet, what Jason perceived were too many different affinities, and more importantly, too many physiques that had been refined with different body refining techniques. The Shiabi clan shelters other big clans, Jason mumbled, which was heard by Shane, who nodded his head. That's right. There multiple big clans that decided to depart to the Chandra clan after they had been attacked and overwhelmed by an alliance of multiple big clans and the reinforcement from the foreign races they're contracted with. This alliance is also the biggest problem the Chandra country will have to face according to the captain of the combat unit we've been talking to. Jason didn't say anything to that because it was expected that some common foreign races would establish an alliance. If they were unable to get their hands on the human race alone, dividing them with a few other races, they're in a peace agreement which would make everything easier. As long as races that were hostile towards them didn't receive anything from this war, those races were fine with everything. In the end, Jason was sure that multiple alliances of foreign common races existed. Even those that wanted to gain nothing but combat experience would have to use this tactic to prevent being overwhelmed and annihilated. Otherwise, the common combat units would be annihilated without gaining anything, and it was obvious how great of an effect this would bring forth. It was useless and a waste of time, as such Jason assumed that all common races had or would establish an alliance with each other. They had to fight against the higher races too, and a high numerical advantage was sometimes great enough to outweigh pure quality. Less than 10 minutes had passed when Jason, his masters, and Emily had entered the Shiabi clan's main hall that looked like a huge ball hall. There was nothing special inside, and Jason was sure that the Shiabi clan had already taken away everything special in order to prevent anyone from taking anything away. This might sound petty, but it was better to use all means to prevent a chaotic situation within their own rows. What would happen if a young, yet greedy youth were to steal something because it looked beneficial for himself? There was no need to bother about something like that as long as everything overly valuable was taken away. Jason could see the remains of objects with very strong mana fluctuations, and he assumed most of them to be weapons. Maybe they've taken the weapons away to use them during the war too. Everything was possible, and it was great to have strong weapons in a way that might take a very long time. Nobody could foretell what the next few years would bring, and Jason was glad that the Shiabi clan did not hold back from utilizing their heirlooms or treasured weapons. Suddenly, Jason saw 3 familiar young men walking through the clan hall with an unfamiliar girl next to them. This caused him to smile involuntarily as he shouted out, "Milan, Iska, Yoon, hello." Artemis' wings were still folded on his back, but he lifted one in order to show the 3 young men, who he had encountered within the mythic garden, where he was. The group of 4 was astonished to hear someone shouting the 3 young men's names through the clan hall, as it was frowned down upon if someone shouted in a clan hall. However, when the 3 young men saw Jason, they were astonished for a short moment before they had already approached him with fast strides. "Jason, how are you doing? But, why are you here? Is your clan not doing well either?" Yoon, who was one of the descendants from the Shiabi family, asked, not able to cover his worry. They had sheltered lots of big clans, and Yoon was not sure how good it would be to accept another big clan, or even an ancient clan, to seek asylum within their headquarters. There were too many disputes with each other that Yoon's head was aching if he just thought about it. However, when Yoon saw that Jason shook his head, Yoon was relieved. "Not really, my masters and another disciple of one of my masters were in the Chandra country. We thought that it might be the best to inquire more intel about the recent happenings around the war. At the same time, it might not be the worst idea to help out a little bit, right?" Jason smiled, but he was wondering about the fact that the clan Iska and more importantly Milan belonged to Wither. They might still be in a soul contract with the foreign races after all. From what he could tell, the Jewel clan was the bigger problem, which was mainly because he had no idea what kind of soul contract the Maldor clan had signed with the foreign race they had colluded with. This caused him to eye his 2 friends for a short moment before Iska, who noticed Jason's vigilance, smiled weirdly. "You don't have to be worried about our clans or the foreign race we had been colluded with. We severed all soul contracts by receiving severe punishment. Fortunately, our clan heads didn't include every clan member within the soul contracts we had with the Laza race. Otherwise, not only the patriarch, vice-patriarch and a few higher authorities would have been punished, but all of us. Nevertheless, the punishment was lighter than expected and almost all big clans could sever the soul contracts with the foreign races without many issues. They almost died, but that was something we could prevent. It was almost as if those races would have never imagined that the big clans would terminate the soul contract. When Jason heard this, his smile widened while Shane and Dahlia lifted their eyebrow because they began to wonder what kind of punishment the higher authorities of the Maldor clan had received. However, when he thought about the clan heads being punished, Jason was involuntarily drawn to Milan. Clearing his throat, he could only say, "What about your mother?" Instead of beating around the bush, Jason would rather tear open a wound and ask straightforwardly, which was exactly what he had done. Yet, differently than expected, Milan just said, "Both her soul and mana core have been badly injured, but with the right treatment and resources, she will get better." He said this, with an almost emotionless voice, which was a big contrast to the Milan he got to know within the Mythic Garden. If it's not his mother, what has happened to him? Nevertheless, Jason didn't feel any pity towards Milan's mother because she was one of the members that had supported enslavement. However, before Jason could ask, the girl that was together with the others ignored the atmosphere that was about to turn bad as she stepped forward and introduced herself. "Hello, my name is Arya Mella. That's a nice tattoo you have there. The fortified soul conjunction with your flying soul bond seems to be strong too, but why do you look so young? How old are you?" Chapter 427 Exposing by Hydesgrain. Jason could only smile when he saw how curious the pretty woman, with her long and slender legs, brown hair, eyes, and pretty features, was. "Hello Arya, nice to meet you, my name is Jason." "You're right, I'm not that old." After that, he turned back to his friends, ignoring Arya's question about his age. He had no intention to talk with Arya because he was more curious about what had happened to his friends during the last few months. 9 months had passed since then and lots of events should have happened. They had liquefied a few more drops of mana, but compared to his advancement, theirs was almost negligible. Even if their advancement speed was fast, Jason was even faster in liquefying the compressed liquefied drops of mana than his friends could liquefy common drops of mana. Nevertheless, the first thing he did was to introduce his masters and Emily to everyone before Shane and would talk to the Shiabi clan's patriarch, proposing their support. At that moment, the middle-aged man, who was the captain of the earlier combat unit Jason's masters and Emily had encountered, entered the clan hall. Jason noticed something weird. He stopped chatting with his friends for a moment as his attention was drawn to the middle-aged man who started to talk with the patriarch that had just entered the clan hall from a different entrance. After half a minute, both the patriarch and the middle-aged man looked in the direction which led Jason to retrace Artemis' wings before they disintegrated as Artemis left his mana core. "What's going on?" Jason was confused for a short moment before he noticed that the middle-aged man rushed towards them, followed by the Shiabi clan's patriarch. He looked at Yoon for a moment, astonished to see him and his friends next to a black-haired youth and his presumed masters. A few seconds passed and the whole group stared at the Shiabi clan patriarch, who had already scanned through everyone's mana core, as he turned towards Shane and Dahlia. He was unable to see through their mana core, which was interested and not something he encountered often. "Greetings, I don't think we're acquainted with each other. I'm the Shiabi clan patriarch, Merle Shabi, and want to sincerely thank Sir and Madam for helping our combat unit. This reduced the number of casualties drastically. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say this, but I would like to request something." The Afrita and Afri regained their consciousness, and we were about to question them. Unfortunately, both said that they would only talk if the person who caught them is present. "I hope this is not too much of a request, but I hope Sir or Madam can follow me. This is very important and we might be able to procure important information." When Shane and Dahlia heard this, they looked at each other a little dumbfounded before they turned to Jason, who remained unmoved as Emily began to laugh out loud. This was unexpected, however. Jason had to suppress his laughter too. The Shabi clan patriarch thought that Shane or Dahlia had caught the Afrita and Afri, while it was in fact Jason who had done so. Unfortunately, Emily's laughter was inappropriate for such a serious topic, which was the reason for Jason to suppress laughing out. As such, she was eyed weirdly, and it was only when Dahlia covered her disciple's mouth with her own hand that Emily notices that something was wrong. Shane and the captain of the combat unit were about to clear the misunderstanding when Jason had already stepped forward as he said, "I caught them, not my masters. Where do I have to go?" Milan, Iska, and Yoon were astonished when they heard that Jason had caught an Afrita and Afri, but both Milan and Iska thought that Jason's high soul amplification might be what made it possible for him to achieve this feat. If they would have known that Jason was currently walking around without receiving any amplification in his strength, they wouldn't believe a single word about him being able to catch someone from a foreign race. The middle-aged captain was about to say something, only to be intercepted by the Shabi clan's patriarch. "But the Afrita has already liquefied 100 drops of mana, and entered the Grandmagus rank. You have liquefied 4 drops of mana. Don't lie to me. I don't like being played around." Merle turned back to Shane and Dahlia, still in the opinion that one of them had caught the Afrita and Afri, only for Shane to say, "I'm sorry to say this, but my disciple really caught them." At that time, the captain of the combat unit was finally able to speak up as he said, "Patriarch, I was just about to say this. This youngster was the one who caught both the Afrita and Afri, and they want to see him." After that, he whispered, "Even the Afrita wants to speak, but only with this young man and a translator of the Arior race." The only ones who were able to retain calm were Jason, his masters, and Emily, while the Shiabi clan patriarch, Yoon, and the others stared at Jason in shock. "You defeated a Grandmagus rank Afrita. When we left the Mythic Garden you've been at the master rank." Milan mumbled while Iska and Yoon couldn't help but silently agree. Arya, who had just met Jason, stared at him with the same thought lingering in her mind as everyone else. How can someone with 4 drops of liquefied mana defeat a Grandmagus with 100 drops? Someone from a foreign race at that. It was hard to comprehend as Shane, who wanted to calm down everyone, said, "My disciple has strong soul bonds that enhance his physical strength greatly. His soul awakening was great too. The number of liquefied drops of mana might be important for others but not for someone with a good soul awakening. There are other ways to augment one's strength, right? A fortified soul conjunction, for example." Shane wanted to protect Jason by revealing the secrets that had already been exposed to others. As long as his identity as someone with the blood of the Celestia race remained hidden, everything was fine. He would even retort to exposing his real identity as Shane Blair if it was required. This might not be problematic as long as he remained within the Shiabi clan, but there were too many clans that hated him, for whatever reason they had. In the end, Shane couldn't even explain why most big clans loathed him. The only thing he did was to annihilate one clan. He didn't even massacre the descendants of the big clans that had been at the Shaw clan headquarters at that time. This would have been a good reason for him to be pursued by a greater number of big clans, but Shane didn't do anything to them. Merle just nodded his head and decided to think about the youth's talent later as he said, "The Afrita and Afri are locked in a small prison which the Arior race has constructed. You don't have to be worried about anything. Someone from the Arior race will meet you there and translate everything you and the Afrita say. Other than that, it would be great if you can figure out some information from the Afri too. Like how they have been contacted by the Afrita race and what kinds of benefits they've received in return." Jason nodded his head, ignoring the shocked expressions his friends had as he said, "I'm ready. If there is nothing else to do, I can meet the Afrita and Afri immediately." Chapter 428 Suicide by Hydesgrain. Standing in front of a large, yet ordinary-looking set of cages. Jason looked around before he saw the Afriter and Afri he had caught. They were in different cages that were placed right next to each other and were being locked up. An Arior was taking care of them right now, using its silver affinity before it took out handcuffs from the spatial ring it had. After enveloping the handcuffs with the quicksilver it had manifested, the Arior sealed the Afriter and Afri's already damaged mana core by cuffing their hands with the unique-looking handcuffs. From the appearance, both the cages and handcuffs looked very ordinary, but Jason knew that this was not the case. The materials used for everything were extremely precious by mankind's standards, and he doubted that one could produce handcuffs or a cage as the ones he saw in front of him with the materials one could find on Argos. Furthermore, Jason was able to perceive hundreds of tiny runes inscribed within the innermost parts of the cages and handcuffs. Seeing all of that, he felt safe, and his previous thought about the Afriter and Afri trying to take revenge on him with a hidden trump had almost completely dispersed. The Arior that had taken care of the prisoners stepped out of the cage until it saw Jason waiting nearby. It didn't know how to speak human language, as such the Arior spoke slowly in the universal language, hoping that it could be roughly understood. "Wait here. Fasro will be here soon." It lifted its liquefied hand and gave him the sign that he should wait, and Jason nodded his head faintly after seeing this. He had understood the Arior, but that didn't mean he could just start speaking in the universal language. "Ah. Okay, thanks." Only 5 minutes later, Jason perceived the strong mana fluctuation from someone flying towards him. He turned around and lifted his head in order to look into the sky, where a 3-meter-tall Arior could be seen. It was probably the Arior called Fasro, and Jason didn't need long to inspect his mana core. He had 6 solidified prismarine crystals and was probably one of or the strongest Arior that was present. Jason was unsure what the highest mana core rank was in order to jump through the world bridges that were called rifts by humans. He had seen a few Prisma stage individuals, but Fasro's mana core rank was even higher than the Shadow Walker he had encountered a long time ago. It had almost been 2 years since that day, and Jason didn't even notice that so much time had passed. Being busy with all kinds of tasks was definitely one of the biggest reasons for this. Another reason would be that absorbing mana allows one to lose the track of time during the fully focused state of one's mana absorption. Taking a deep breath, Jason greeted Fasro, the Arior, who was diving towards him, in human language. "Hello sir, my name is Jason Stella. Nice to meet you." The moment Fasro arrived on the ground, he was greeted by a human that looked extremely young for the human race's standards. This led him to scan through the youth's mana core, which was large in size. However, the young man had only 4 drops of liquefied mana, which caused him to ask, "Are you sure that you've defeated the Afriter and Afri?" Jason, who had expected that he would be asked this question, summoned Solaris. It released its whole strength at once before burning down within a moment, and Jason didn't have to say anything as the Arior said, "You were the human with the high-ranked origin flame, I see. This has nothing to do with the later investigation of the Afriter and Afri, but do you mind telling me how you obtained this origin flame? I guess you can tell that the black origin flame is not ordinary, and there shouldn't be a flame like that on Argos. Even on our worlds, there might only be one such flame in several thousand years, and that would already be fortunate." When Jason had heard this, he was astonished for a moment, because Solaris was rarer than he had expected. One high-ranked origin flame, every few thousand years on several planets. To be honest, I found Solaris in its crystal state on a small island called Asterix. At that time I was in the hideout of a mutated, Lord-ranked Goblin King with a strong fire ability. If I were to guess, I would say that it was someone from a foreign race, who provided the black origin flame crystal, trying to make the Goblin King stronger. Jason finished answering and wiped away the sweat that had formed on his forehead. "Luckily, I said Lord rank and not late lick. Goblin King. I doubt that a real Goblin King arrived on Argos, otherwise the whole planet would have been destroyed by now." After Fasro had said that in the human language he had switched to the universal language as he mumbled to himself. Rather than a goblin king, it might have been one of its descendants. That's more likely as they can procure multiple affinities, but who would try to nurture a goblin king's descendant with a high-ranked origin flame? On a planet without an extremely low density of mana at that. Jason was astonished about what he heard, but his expression didn't move an inch as he asked. Shall we interrogate the Afrita and Afri first? If Sir wants to, we can talk about other things later. I'm very interested in the Arior race, other races, and the worlds Sir has been talking about. Fasro felt that Jason was different from other humans because he was not instinctively repulsive, angry, or even disgusted by their race, which was made up of a liquefied mass of special quicksilver. There were only a few humans that had been able to talk freely with the Ario race, without the need to hold back or think too much about the words they spoke. In the end, mankind's current stance, and the fact that the Arior race helped the Shabi clan because they had a soul bond with a cleanse curse ability, were good reasons for their behavior. Additionally, there was the instinctive disgust most humans had against foreign races because of the past. If one were to add that the Arior race was a liquid race, whose only similar trait was the human appearance some of the Arior race had. Yet, the young youth, whose appearance seemed to be unique among his race too, was behaving as if there was no difference between him being a human and that he was talking to an Arior right now. His eyes were gleaming brightly and he had a faint smile on his lips. Just call me Fasro, and if you want, I can bring you to someone more knowledgeable than me. She can tell you a lot more than I can. This was something Jason didn't expect, but it made him happy and he said, "Thank you, that would be great." After their short introduction was finally done, Jason entered the first cage in which the Afri sat inside, while Fasro went inside the cage with the Afrita inside. "I brought the human you wanted to see, now tell me where your hideout is," Fasro said with a cold voice as he released quicksilver from his hands that enveloped the Afrita who was staring at the Ario with killing intent leaking from his eyes. "You disgusting mass of shit, let's see how long you'll feel like your race and this puny human clan will have the upper hand." Exclamation mark. "We shall give you a surprise for bringing the human with you. It's just unfortunate that your race is too full of itself. Did you really think the Callistra cages and handcuffs would be enough to hinder us in taking revenge?" Jason had heard the words which the Afrita had shouted out, and only a moment later, he could see a faint, yet cruel smile in the Afri's face, who stared at him. FCK. It was not difficult to connect the clues the Afrita's words and Afri's expression showcased. At the same time, he saw this, his mana eyes perceived how a tiny, red drop that looked similar to liquefied drops of mana, yet crimson red in color, entered the Afri's mana core. A chain reaction was caused and the mana core within the Afri began to heat up within the next few seconds as he said, "Goodbye, fool." Chapter 429 Torrential Energy by Hydesgrain. Goodbye, fool. The moment the Afri had said this, Jason had already started to move. Yet, instead of rushing back to leave the cage, he pushed himself forward as Solaris had already entered his mana core. Releasing his entire stored mana in addition to Solaris mana at once, huge, yet, highly compressed flames shot out of Jason's hand that had pierced through the Afri's chest straight into its mana core. The Afri's mana core was also the place where the Creato flame, that was about to erupt, was located. The Creato flame had absorbed the Afri's life force that was not sealed and it was unable to devour the high quantity of nutritions it received, at once. As such, it was about to unleash its full might, when Jason's hand had pierced through the Afri's chest, straight into the mana core, that was already damaged and about to crumble. "Devour everything!" Jason shouted, and Solaris, whose greed had been revealed, screamed out in joy as the crumbling mana core had already been fully enveloped by the black origin flames. A moment later, they infiltrated every little space of the mana core, and the creator flame that was being overwhelmed and suppressed. However, it was still not enough to prevent the Creato flame from imploding, which it was about to happen at any moment, when Jason forced Solas, who reject Jason's plan, to utilize the devoured energy to enhance its mana nullification ability. As such, within the next few moments, the suppressed Creato flame that was about to be unleashed had been fully repressed, while Solaris devoured it without showing any mercy. The smile on the Ifrit had stiffened the moment Jason had pierced through its chest, knowing that its suicidal attack had been useless. Yet, before it was able to do anything, the Ifrit's eyes had turned dim. Solaris was still devouring the Creato flame until the very last strand. Meanwhile, the surrounding temperature had increased significantly, and Fasro, who had also understood what the Ifrita had said, was about to charge outside the other cage to help Jason, only to notice that it was not necessary. How does he have so much mana? Didn't he have only 4 drops of liquefied mana in his core? And is that a mana nullification ability the Black Origin Flame has? Fasro was astonished about both Jason and Solaris. Jason had more mana than the Arior race had with the same amount of liquefied drops of mana, while the Black Origin Flame was something he had yet to fully comprehend. Nevertheless, it was great that Jason had survived, and that was everything that counted. He was talented, and it would worsen the relationship between the Arior race and Shiabi clan if a great talent would die because of their negligence. As such, Fasro was glad to see that the Black Origin Flame devoured the enormous energy that had been released from the Ifrit's mana core. Yet, Jason was not as happy as Fasro because he felt that the torrential energy Solaris absorbed was wreaking havoc within its mana core. Solaris transmitted him that everything was fine, but Jason could tell that this was not exactly the case. The torrential energy was not even made out of flames, but a weird energy that was similar to mana, yet completely different. Jason was unable to comprehend it, and he could only estimate that it had something to do with the drop of life vis he had seen before. Suddenly, Petri, who was able to sense everything as Artemis and Scorpio could too, transmitted Jason a weird thought. Why would Petri want to absorb the torrential energy? He has barely liquefied 3 drops of mana. How should he be able to endure such compressed energy waves? It was unknown how Petri was so sure that the life force that had been forcefully liquefied was beneficial for him. However, Jason could tell that his youngest soulbond was confident. As such, he released Petri, who had already reached the length of 6 meters and the width of Jason's tights. He had ordered Solaris to divide the torrential energy from the Creato flame it had already devoured. Only pure energy was left behind. Solaris had already left Jason's mana core and appeared in front of Petri, whose eyes were gleaming in greed as he opened his maw widely. A moment later, the energy Solaris couldn't contain was released and the blood-red drop of compressed life force emerged. Its size had shrunk a little bit, but the Creato flame had been unable to make use of the complete life force it had been provided with. The moment the blood-red drop of liquefied life force emerged from Solaris, Petri lunged towards it and devoured it without hesitation. Only seconds later the drop of life force dissolved and Petri's whole body began to heat up. However, what happened afterward was astonishing. The torrential energy that had been ravaging in Solaris' mana core was becoming calm as it spread through Petri's body. Jason was not sure what happened, but Petri told him that he had to hibernate for some time to digest the energy it had absorbed. At the same time, a faint, white hue had begun to envelop Petri, and Jason could only stare at his youngest soulbond flabbergasted. Is Petri evolving? He had seen the same scenario already once, and it had been Artemis, his first soulbond, who had already broken through her racial limits at that time, only to evolve at an unexpected time. The same seemed to happen with Petri, but Jason was not sure what exactly the life force could be used for, when Fasro had already appeared behind him. You humans are certainly special. This soulbond is lucky too. To think that it could absorb the pure life force of several dozen individuals from the Askron race, but why was that within the Ifrit? Jason didn't understand what Fasro, who had turned to the Ifrita, had said. What did the Ifrita race to the Askron race? Why is there a compressed life force of several dozen Askron within such an insignificant existence as the Afri was? Phasro was visibly shocked, but the same could be said about the Afrita. How did you survive that? The Afrita was enraged and not sure what was going on as Jason, who had taken Petri and Solaris within his soul world, turned towards it. His eyes were eerily cold as he walked outside the cage to enter the Afrita's cage. Phasro followed suit, not sure what Jason was about to do as he saw a long scimitar appearing within Jason's hand. However, before he could even do anything, Jason had already slashed at the Afrita, severing one of his arms as he asked, "What is that energy and why was it within the Afri?" He could barely refrain from speaking in the universal language, and it was only when Phasro translated Jason's words, that the Afrita, who was screaming out in pain, understood him. Nevertheless, it didn't answer anything and was about to mock Jason, as their eyes met. Jason's killing intent was fully released within his eyes, while the golden silverish eyes had been activated by the energy stored within the separate mana storage. With his killing intent release, his mana eyes abyssal ability utilized, and the petrification curse activated, the Afrita that was about to mock him turned quiet in an instant as Jason repeated his question. There was no translation required because the Afrita knew what Jason wanted to know. "We abducted several hundred Askron and draw out their life force while barely keeping them alive." Jason didn't know what race the Askrons were, but he was sure that Phasro would tell him if he asked. After the Afrita had answered, Jason didn't wait for Phasro to translate everything as he asked, "Where is your hideout and how many of you are there?" Once the question had been translated, Jason noticed that the mana within his eyes began to be used up too fast, and it would only be a few seconds before it would be fully used up. As such, he slashed out with Byakur again, severing the last limb the Afrita had left. While screaming in pain, he shouted out, "Yazlawn Caves. Several 100,000. Chapter 430 Comparison by Hydesgrain. Several 100,000. Jason mumbled as he retraced his killing intent before Byakur vanished. It had entered Jason's soul world and rested there, while Jason looked at Phasro, who was not sure what to think about what had happened right now. However, before he would start to comprehend everything he had heard, Phasro rushed towards the Afrita whose arms had been severed. He enveloped the Afrita's two stumps that remained with his mana to seal them before he turned to Jason. "Good job, I guess. We now know their hideout and the number." "That's great, but the Askron race is too pitiful, the too many races after them." Jason tilted his head at these words as he asked, "This might be a far-fetched assumption, but is the Askron race a race with vibrant life force or physical strength? 'Cause I don't understand why Petri, the petrification serpent you've seen earlier, wanted to absorb their compressed life force." Phasro was already in his own thoughts when he heard Jason as he nodded his head. The Askron race is known for their high physical strength that stems from their unparalleled life force. However, they're unable to absorb mana under normal circumstances, and even after adjusting themselves by using unique techniques, their progress is only slow. If they could enhance their life force instead of the mana core within them, they wouldn't be a common race, but at least a grand race. What a pity that they have yet to find a way to strengthen their life force without relocating their origin planet. It was interesting to hear something new, and Jason couldn't help but think about the new possibility he had heard. Enhance one's life force. That would be entirely different from the path of absorbing mana. Life force should be considered as something innate, while mana can be absorbed and released at will. Phasro nodded his head as he said, "The most powerful Askron learned how to handle mana too, but it can be said that they're mutants of their race. They're barely able to amplify their physique or certain body parts with it." However, just as Phasro had said this, he noticed how weird the current situation was. Jason had just survived a suicidal attack that should have killed him under normal circumstances, before he had released all his anger at the Afrita by severing his arms, only to make up theories as if nothing had happened. Furthermore, Jason seemed to accept the fact that a different energy than mana existed too easily. With this in mind, Fasro had an idea as he baited Jason, who was currently deep in thought, trying to make sense out of the information he received. Did you know that mankind's cultivation system is completely wrong? The 7 stages your race has are only 3 large stages in our cultivation system, namely the mortal, lick, and prisma stage. To put it more simply, your race has yet to reach the 8th and 9th stage that would be included in the prisma stage too. Jason didn't listen carefully at Fasro's words and just said, I know that we're weak and you forgot to mention that those 3 stages are just the beginning. It's ridiculous how proud we are of ourselves, isn't it? Suddenly, Jason noticed to whom he was talking and his body stiffened as he looked at Fasro, whose liquefied body was also turned towards him. He could just smile oddly as he scratched the back of his head. Oops. Fasro had assumed that Jason knew more than he had exposed, but to hear that he was fully aware of the universal race cultivation system astonished him a little bit. Yet, before he could say anything, Jason hurriedly said, I was taught a little bit of the universal language and read the information I just said from a body refining manual of an extinct race. Taught a little bit of the universal language. Does that include speaking? In that case, can you understand me? Fasro asked in the universal language, and Jason, who understood the Arior's scheming, acted as if he tried to translate everything in his mind before he nodded his head. Jason had already messed up everything, and it was important to cover his mistake without showing that he could perfectly understand and read the universal language. This was important, at least for now. It was interesting to hear that a human had tried to learn the universal language, but not really something surprising. Even the Shiabi clan patriarch was able to speak and understand a little bit of the universal language. It made everything easier after all. As such, Fasro didn't ask Jason anything else. Instead, he began to think about the information the Afrita had revealed. Yazlawn Caves, where are they? And how could the Afrita race bring several 100,000 of their race? Are they trying to decimate their own army? It was also possible that their population increased by such a large degree, that losing hundreds of thousands of Afrita wouldn't be important anymore. Maybe nurturing bloodthirsty elite troops has become more important for them. It could also be possible that they're searching for a suitable human as a host of a Creato flame. When Fasro thought about that, he stared at Jason, who was most likely a candidate to act as the host of a Creato flame. However, only a moment later did he shook his head, thinking that the high-ranked origin flame would simply devour the Creato seed before it would be able to bloom. He works hard and carefully. Despite his age and him being a human, he is strong but not arrogant. That's admirable. Our younger generation should be like him. Jason was currently thinking about cultivating one's life force and how it might be, but, at the same time, a different thought appeared in his mind. I wonder how old most Arior are when they reach the Lick and Prisma stage. Since he had figured out that the universal cultivation system was completely different compared to that mankind used, Jason had begun to compare himself to other races in every possible way. As such, he couldn't help but feel that he had to ask Fasro as he was alone with him, if one were to ignore the Afrita that had fainted. I don't know if this question is considered rude, but how old is the average Arior when they liquefied their first drop of mana, and the first solidified prismarine crystal? What about prodigies? It was not really a surprise that Jason asked such a question, and it would be weird if he was not curious about the strength of other races. He had to figure out how talented he was in comparison after all. The average Arior enters the Lick stage at the age of 14 and solidifies their first prismarine crystal before the age of 40. The shock Fasro expected to see didn't come true, and Jason was just intently listening, waiting to receive more information. Our prodigies enter the Lick stage at the age of 8 and solidify their first prismarine crystal before the age of 16. This astonished Jason a lot, and his eyes widened as he suddenly thought about multiple factors which he listed unintentionally. Higher race, greater mana density and purity, more and greater resources and better cultivation manuals. I'm not faring as bad as expected. Listing the factors he was or had been lacking, Jason felt much better. If he were to add that he was unable to absorb mana for himself until he was almost 14 years old, the facts Fasro had just listed didn't seem to be that great. As such, he smiled at Fasro as he thanked him properly. Who cares if I enter the Prisma stage at the age of 16 or in my 20s? Argos mana will hinder me in absorbing mana, either way. Jason's biggest disadvantage was neither that he had to insert mana into his eyes for several years nor the fact that his bloodline had just awoken. It was also not important that he would require better cultivation techniques in the future, but more the fact that Argos mana was too scarce and impure for Jason to absorb properly. His mana absorption had increased, and to use this advantage properly, he would have to use up a huge amount of resources, while other races would receive the same amount of mana from their surroundings. Nevertheless, instead of feeling discouraged, Jason was glad that the prodigies of a higher race were already so great. He assumed that Fasro had spoken about the best prodigies their race had, and Jason couldn't help but become excited. When will I be able to spar against true prodigies from other races?